Well, it's a real pleasure for me to be here. I have to confess that I'm not a loud speaker, so if in the back, if you're not hearing, well, Mel Saby back there, just give me that's the volume indicator, okay? And I'm just looking at this. I need to be through by 3:55, okay. So, let me just start by saying I really believe that religious freedom is foundational in a lot of ways. It's historically foundational because it's really the oldest, at least the oldest of the internationally recognized human rights. It's also philosophically foundational because, well, among other things, it really provides the basis to protect the worldviews that are the basis for our other philosophical ideas, and also many of the rationalia that we use for freedom of speech, for other kinds of things, were initially worked out with respect to freedom of religion. It's also institutionally foundational because freedom of religion protects the institutions that are really the seedbeds of our liberty, the seedbeds of our other ideas, and so it's really critical. It's critical to protect the processes by which and the institutions that really make everything else possible. And these days, I'd also say it's empirically foundational because we have a lot more information today about how significant freedom of religion is, although it's in part because it's the grandparent of other rights. It's a kind of a neglected grandparent these days, and it's a little easy to see other things and to forget its importance. I worry sometimes that we have taken freedom of religion for granted for so long in this country that we tend to forget how it lies behind and protects a lot of other things. Now, in my time, my aspiration is to try and do 5 things. That's probably a mistake. I mean, the French would never let you do more than 3, right? But I want to just say some things quickly about some international trends and some of the forces contributing to the erosion of religious freedom. Then I want to talk about trends in the United States, and I don't know that, I haven't counted, this might be a top 10, religious freedom threats in North America. Actually, people will disagree. You could have I'm not going to touch on everything. The cases are being litigated by people like Luke. I, of course, sit in an ivory tower, so I don't do that as much, although I sneak out sometimes and do some amicus briefs. And then I want to say some things about challenges for the future. So let me just plunge ahead. I think people don't realize the scope. I mean, the truth is we talk about religious freedom problems in our country, but believe me, every time I come, this mic is not quite tall enough for me. Every time I come back through the passport barriers, I'm always grateful to be in the U.S. because the kinds of problems we're facing here are so much less severe than the problems that you see in other parts of the world where people are losing their lives. The sort of the hemorrhage of Christians out of the Middle East, the problems that Muslims are facing in Burma, the problems, just horrendous problems that we should be grateful for our problems. But let me just give you sort of a general overview picture. These bar charts represent the red at the top is the number of countries that have high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. You can see that the percentage has been going up over the past several years. This is based on some data done by the Pew Forum. Many of you may have seen this. But what's significant and the red parts of the bars here are larger because this is now the amount of population in the world that lives in those countries. You've got countries like China, India, Indonesia, that have serious restrictions. And so because so much population, this means that over 3/4 of the world is living in countries with high or very high restrictions. Some of the restrictions are social, some of the restrictions are legal, but it's a very significant situation. So these are the countries that have the highest legal restrictions on religious freedom. Not surprisingly, China, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia. Then the next category down is the more moderate countries, and then you get the sort of the rest of the world. Now that sometimes the situation will be different with respect to social hostilities. So interestingly, on this one, China is not on this list. India is. Our Hindu friend may pick up on me later, but the point is that it's very interesting that you could have. I mean, the level of social restrictions in China is about like the United States, but the level of government restrictions is very high. This suggests that they could liberalize significantly without problems. On the other hand, India has these very high social tensions, which makes things more difficult. Anyway, this gives you a really quick picture, but the point of the picture is that there is a lot of restriction out there, and whatever people see or worry about in this country, believe me, it's minor by comparison to what we see elsewhere. Now, the great irony about this is that empirically, we know more about the significance of religious freedom than ever before. This is just a kind of a visual representation of the fact that there are a range of social goods that correlate. If you look across the countries of the world, there's very high correlation between countries that have high levels of freedom of religion and countries that have a number of other social goods. Now, some of this is obvious. If you have high levels of freedom of religion, it's likely you're going to have high levels of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, some of the other civil and political rights. But some of the other things are not so obvious. High levels of religious freedom go with gender empowerment. I think that's not always something that would jump out at people and be obvious. There's longevity of democracy. If a country has been in a non-democratic situation, moves to democracy, they will do better if they have strong religious liberty protections. Lower levels of armed conflict, higher percentage of GDP being spent on public health. There's some other things that aren't here. There are higher literacy rates. There are just a range of social goods that correlate. Now, of course, these are correlations. I don't have time to go into this in more detail, but there are really strong reasons for thinking that this is more than just correlations, that there are causal connections that contribute to this being the case. So on the one hand, we have this worsening situation of protections of religious liberty, even though in many ways we know that if things could move the other way, it would unleash a lot of other social goods. Now, let me just say a few words, and all I can do is just talk very generally about some of the things that are contributing to the erosion of religious freedom. Now, I think one of the first things I would say is there aren't really many people that speak up against religious freedom. I mean, the prima facie case for religious freedom is very strong. We've had some centuries now of experience showing that it really works. It works well. It's good for all the reasons that Luke Goodrich articulated a few minutes ago. There are some things happening. The Smith case, referred to by Judge Timkovich, limited or weakened religious freedom protections. Those have been restored. We had the Religious Freedom Restoration Act at the federal level, although the court sort of nipped away at the state half of that. After that happened, our count is that it's about 31 states that have either judicially, through interpreting their state constitution, or legislatively have adopted the equivalent of a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, insisting on higher standards. If there's a religious freedom violation, it has to have very strong justification if it's to withstand scrutiny. So what happens is not so much, well, globally, I mean, there are places like China where there are 5 official religions, and then there's sort of a gray market in other religions that the government will sort of let operate. So you have some narrowing of the basic notion of religious freedom itself, but it's not so much that. It's erosion by exception. So if you think about it, there are a lot of different kinds of forces that are not necessarily connected in themselves, but all of them in one way or another lead people to think, well, of course, religious freedom is fine, but, and it's the buts that are getting bigger and bigger. So the general process of secularization in society, and the fact that more and more people are apathetic about religious freedom, kind of growing culture of relativism in society, the rise of competing rights and interests, burgeoning state regimes, that is the scope of modern states is just much bigger and encroaches on more and more space, and therefore there's less room for rights. Expanding transitional regimes, or transnational regimes, I'm sorry, I mistyped this, affects things. I think a really big one is security concerns. After 9/11, literally like the day or two after, the UN passed some resolutions calling on other countries to pass security legislation, and believe me, some of the places like Russia did it with a vengeance. So that globally, but even here, concerns about security will cut into the domain of religious freedom. Now, this isn't to say that we shouldn't be concerned about security, but one of the problems is sometimes as people are concerned about security and pass legislation in that area, the result is really counterproductive, because it puts religion on the defensive, and then people fight back. Consolidation of power by authoritarian regimes. Authoritarians will use the excuse of security to strengthen their regimes, to punish their enemies, and this can spill over into religious persecution. And of course, we've seen, on the one hand, the resurgence of dominant religions, such as the Orthodox, Russian Orthodox tradition in former Soviet space, or Muslims in certain parts of the world, or ideologies such as Marxism in China, Vietnam, and so forth. Well, these are all complex phenomena, but as you think about it, you can see that these forces, in a way, cut against religious freedom. Okay, now I'm going to just say a few words about the American landscape. This is background. This is based on some data from the Pew Research Center. There are different divisions of Pew, so I have to look and make sure which one we're talking about. Whoops, I touched something wrong, sorry. Let me get back to the... Oh dear. Okay, well, we have to go fast now. Quick review. Okay. I have to remember not to touch my screen on this computer. So in a way, what we've seen, I think everyone's conscious that there's been some drop in the level of religiosity in America, a modest drop in overall rates, although religiously affiliated Americans tend to be as observant as before. Now I'm going to just, I'm just picking out a few things. So this shows a slight decline in religious belief, not religious relief, sorry, religious belief and practice. I don't know how that typo got in there, interesting. But if you look at all U.S. adults, there's been a decline over 2007 to 2014 of about 3% of the number who would say they believe in God. It's a pretty high number in the United States. The number that say they pray daily has dropped from about 58% to 55%. That say religion is very important, similar, about a 3% drop. So there's some falling off, but not mega. I think these numbers are probably too small, so I'll skip over that. One of the interesting things, people are very conscious sociologically of the rise of the nuns. This is not Little Sisters of the Poor, it's the N-O-N-E-S, the people who indicate that they have no affiliated religion when they're asked this question on surveys. And but what's interesting is this does not necessarily mean that they're not religious. It just means, certainly many of them will be non-religious, but many of them may just not like organized religion. So they won't feel affiliated, but they will actually have other things that look religious in their lives. So I'm not going to try and read all the fine print, but the upward arrows here are people who indicate that they're experiencing a sense of wonder or a sense of spiritual peace, something other that may not be connected with organized religion. So there are some things going in the opposite direction. Again, I'm afraid the numbers, if you had my eyes and you were Mel Saby sitting in the back, you would not be able to see the screen, so you probably can't. But what's interesting is that it's quite clear that the religiosity is declining more among young people. This is not a surprise, but it's basically sort of, it's much more pronounced among young adults. And one of the questions, you see this a little bit in this, it's the same kind of thing. This is asking the nuns, and the upward things show that they believe less, the things going down. This chart basically shows that they believe less. One of the interesting questions, that it may be a little too early to know, one of the things that's happening is that young people are getting married later and starting families later, and there's always been a kind of a return back to religion as people start raising their own families. And so one of the things we don't know about the nuns is if there, to what extent there may be something like that. If the trend of the rising generation being less and less religious continues, this will be very serious for religion. If there's a kind of switch back that just is hitting a little bit later in life, that may be different. Okay, now again, you won't be able to read the numbers, but you see on the top parts of the charts, the numbers are trending up. So this is the sort of sympathy for same-sex marriage and for homosexuality in general, the acceptance among various denominations. It's trending up over time, and it's trending up particularly the younger people get. What's interesting is there isn't the same, so what these charts show is greater acceptance of LGBT lifestyles in society in general. One of the interesting things is there isn't a similar upward trend, that the abortion issues stay about level, or if anything are trending in the opposite direction. Again, what we're seeing at different levels in different groups, but trends upward on acceptance of LGBT lifestyles and so forth. Okay, I apologize for the micrographs, but I think it's sort of interesting to have a sense of those statistics going on. Okay, so now what I want to do is quickly run through just some issues. I'm only going to be able to hit the sort of the headlines, if you will, but some major issues that are going to be issues for religious groups in the years ahead. And these are, to some extent, already issues. So, religious employment. Will religious organizations continue to have the right to employ people that both affirm and live the religious organization's beliefs? Luke Goodrich referred to the Hosanna Tabor case, which provided very strong protection for people who are in ministerial roles, that is, ministers themselves, but a variety of people who are closely connected to carrying out the mission of religious organizations. But there are much harder questions that Judge Timkovich talked about, the Amos case, which was about a janitor in the Deseret Gymnasium. You know, the reality is that religious communities care a lot about people and the religious lives of the people who represent their churches. I remember when the Amos case was, well, shortly after it had been decided, I was at a meeting with religious lawyers for religious universities. It's a strange meeting, but I always remember one of the things that happened is that during the course of that, the lawyer for of Baptist College, I can't remember exactly where he was from, he came up to me and he said, "I want you to know why his place had filed an amicus brief in the Amos case." And by the way, virtually every major American religious group did. He said, "You know, when I was a student, I was at a Baptist college, and I know there are a lot of wonderful Baptists that donate a lot of money, so there would be good professors, so I would learn some things and become a good Baptist. But I was converted by the cook in the cafeteria." This is something that religious leaders understand. And it's why religious communities care immensely about who it is that is representing them, who their employees are, how this works out. Now, there are a lot of complex issues, but this, the core was given unanimous protection. This was an incredibly significant decision from my standpoint. But there is a periphery, there's a periphery going sort of vertically. As you go below the people who are the ministers, the teachers, what about other employees? Can the religious institutions be concerned about that? And also going horizontally, because it's not just churches, it's church universities, it's church, a lot of religious organizations have broadcast entities. It's, there are a lot of different groups that are religiously affiliated, not necessarily the church itself. And so this will be a major issue. Private property. Will religious organizations be able to build, maintain, and preserve their religiously important properties for activities consistent with their religious beliefs? It's actually quite difficult in a lot of places to get zoning approvals. I often tell people if they want to know what they can do for religious liberty, go attend a planning commission meeting when some church other than their own is trying to get land use approvals. It's not easy. There are a lot of constraints. I could talk a lot about that, but I'm not going to have time. Tax-exempt status, I think it's no secret that one of the next rounds that we will see coming, and we're already seeing it, is challenges to tax-exempt status of groups who have traditional religious beliefs, either about the family, about sexual conduct, and so forth. Equal access to government resources. It's clear under the Establishment Clause that the government may not support through direct subsidies religious activity and organizations. On the other hand, it's also been clear in recent Supreme Court decisions over the past couple of decades that where other private organizations, where the government is in effect privatizing and their resources being made available in various ways, there ought to be equal access. That is, the fact that you're a religious group should not be a disqualifying factor if there's a fair competition. And there are also issues about equal access to property, to use of public facilities. If they're open to other groups, should be open to religious groups as well. Religious schools. Will religious schools be able to maintain their religious values while retaining accreditation and right to participate in federal education and research programs? Gordon College, to give one example, in Massachusetts, there's a challenge to their moral covenant that they would have their students take, and whether that would be permissible. There's a challenge going on in Canada right now. Trinity Western is trying to found a law school, and there are a number of places around the country that have said because they have a code of conduct that is sort of normal Christian constraints on sexual behavior, they want to ban or take the position that their students cannot become members of the bar because they've been biased. I mean, it's a complex issue, but that's an ongoing struggle. Freedom of expression. Will religious viewpoints, including those on marriage, family, gender, and sexuality, be suppressed in the public square, the workplace, professional and educational settings, and other important settings where religious believers live out their lives? Another one, and this is often a very sensitive one, parents teaching children under constitutional case law in the United States, under international human rights provisions, but I think many of us think this is just part of the way things are and ought to be. Parents have the right to guide the education of their children. Will parents of children in public schools have reasonable means to ensure that their religious values regarding marriage, family, gender, and sexuality are not directly undermined through classroom instruction or intimidation? We're seeing a lot of cases about that kind of issue around the country. The workplace. Will religious employees be able to maintain their religious identity in the workplace and be reasonably accommodated when work and religious duties conflict? Key kind of case is kind of Muslim woman who feels obligated to do this, wear a hijab, the head covering, but there are countless other questions. There were cases in the UK not long ago about whether stewardesses could wear a cross, even though that wasn't part of the prescribed uniform. A lot of issues in the workplace. Professional credentials. Will professionals lose or be denied licensing for expression of religious views or declining to provide services that are available elsewhere but that are at odds with their religious beliefs? And we've had a lot of examples here, the flower shops, the wedding photographer, wedding cakes. That's one type of issue. Another type of issue is what if someone is a marriage counselor but believes in traditional marriage and not alternative forms of marriage? Do you lose your license because you won't do counseling for lifestyles that you find conscientiously problematic? Small businesses, well, we had a great discussion of Hobby Lobby, so I won't go more into that. I mean, I think the issues are going to be what's happening beyond Hobby Lobby and particularly what's happening beyond Scalia. College campuses, will campus student groups be able to select their own leaders or express a religious message? We've had the Christian Legal Society case, Martinez case in California, holding that you had to make officers, anyone could be officers. You couldn't require your officers to be Christians in the Christian Legal Society or to meet their code of conduct. Public ceremonies and symbols. Will public institutions be able to celebrate religious holidays such as Christmas, permit ceremonial prayer, or retain other vestiges of the community's religious heritage? This, of course, has been an ongoing debate since the school prayer and Bible reading decisions. There's some hard issues here because one doesn't want to impose views, but there's a difference between acknowledging and imposing, and how does that line get drawn? And we'll continue to wrestle with that. Will there be freedom from retaliation? Will the government step in and protect people who are suffering various kinds of retaliation because of their religious views? Okay, now these are some problems. I think one of the big problems is working forward and finding meaningful solutions. And now I've got to try and do this in about 2 minutes. This is a chart done by Robin Fretwell Wilson, who teaches at the University of Illinois. But she was involved in and is a real expert on the Utah Compromise last year. And I think the point I want to make, the Utah Compromise was a compromise on how to deal with protecting religious freedom issues and protecting LGBT rights. So this was right at the heart of the culture wars. I mean, it was a kind of unique compromise because of the unique situation in Utah. But what's interesting, and again, you will not be able to read the fine print. I'll make this wonderful one-page chart that she developed. But here's the point. Utah is at the very bottom, and you see Utah has more check marks, a wider set of check marks than anyone else. This means, what it means at bottom is Utah was giving more protection to LGBT groups, or the same, as was given in any of the blue states. But at the same time, they were also giving protection to the religious community. And because they were trying to protect both, you had a compromise solution that worked. Now, these are incredibly hard compromises to work out. But I think that's one of the things that lies ahead. How do we find ways where people have deep differences? How do we find ways for people to be able to live together? Now, I have a series of slides that are different. It's all different pieces of this one-page chart that I should have printed out and just circulated so you could have. But this was, in a certain sense, very hopeful because you had what is by, any measure, a conservative religious group working hard with a very strong LGBT community, very critical, and working out and finding a lot of ways that there could be mutual respect. And I think that's one of the things that we have to find. We have to be able to get beyond polarizing, fear-mongering, and we have to be able to find ways to really work together. And in a way, protecting both rights that are sort of the non-traditional value rights, LGBT lifestyles, for example, and religious rights. There have got to be ways that we can live together in peace and not constantly be threatening each other. Okay, I'm going to skip over a bunch of other things. So I'm going to have to skip over this. In conclusion, let me just quote something from James Madison. This is from his famous memorial and remonstrance that really led to ultimately to the adoption of Jefferson's Bill on Religious Freedom, and it staved off something that would have taken Virginia in a very different direction. What's important here is the phrase, religious liberty truly is the luster of our country. It can be tarnished easily. It needs to be fought for in every generation. It's an important time in the history of religious freedom, and particularly when we're seeing trends where people are becoming apathetic about religion, where people are forgetting its importance. The truth is, even the people who are non-religious need to understand how important this is, how important it is for them, and how important it is for us all. In the end, we're all minorities. In the end, we all need the protection of this first of our freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Durham, you had a slide that I believe spoke directly to this. But if you could go into more detail about the threat of government forcing pastors, bishops, other ecclesiastical leaders to perform same-sex marriages, given the fact that in most cases the result of that marriage is a certificate that is government-sponsored, government-certified.
Yeah, okay. A couple of things. One, the first thing I would say is at this point there's pretty strong sense that pastors, religious leaders are not going to be coerced to perform marriages inconsistent with their beliefs. There's just very strong constitutional protections that will kick in and protect that, and virtually all of the legislation, to the extent there is legislation on these issues, that's one of the first things that gets protected. But it is quite rational to be worried about that as a primary kind of concern. There was another thread I was going to pick up, but it is. Maybe feel free if I didn't quite get everything on your question. Let me know.
Great. Can you, Michael, right behind you, there's another question right there.
Professor Durham, thank you. This is a more general question. Do you interpret the list of top religious freedom challenges and issues in the United States as strongly indicating an abandonment of the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights by society, executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch?
Well, I guess what I would say is none of those branches is going to, I'm thinking particularly about the First Amendment and more generally the Constitution. I think people continue to be committed to our constitutional heritage. I think it's a disputed heritage in some ways. I mean, different people read different things into the Constitution, obviously. I think what's happening is, perhaps more generally, but particularly in the religion area, is that there's a basic agreement on the norm. People say, of course I believe in religious freedom, but then there will be exceptions, or it will be interpreted more narrowly. For example, I mean, it's been interesting, and I'm not sure how much to make of it. I think sometimes people make a little more of this than they probably should. But the Obama administration will typically affirm the right to freedom of worship. Well, freedom of religion is a lot broader than just worship. I mean, it's a lot broader than what just goes on, you know, within a church on a Sunday, or within a synagogue on a Saturday or Friday evening, or you know, whatever. There are all kinds of other implications. And so I think what happens is there's a narrowing because other people are concerned about other kinds of interests, and they're not illegitimate interests. I mean, there are a lot of very legitimate things that states worry about, that government officials worry about, but there's this drift going on that I think is serious. A little more hesitant to comment more generally on this, sort of the Constitution in general. I think we have some really grand fundamentals of the Constitution. I think religious freedom is one of them. I think freedom of speech is another. I think equality, which actually came later to the Constitution as a result of the Civil War. Separation of powers. I think there's some great fundamental principles that I think are still there. People are interpreting them in different ways. But I think it's important to continue to remind people why some of these things were so important. I think I'm just worried that there's a little bit too much forgetting going on.
Any other comments from the panel? Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Right there, kind of in the middle, around Dave.
Professor Durham, how would you respond to the criticism, and you talk about compromise, that the only reason religious institutions are compromising now is because they have to, and that a few decades ago they refused to compromise because they didn't have to, on issues such as, you know, gay and lesbian equality, things of that nature? Because I hear that a lot, and how would you respond to that criticism?
Well, it's probably true in part. I think one of the arguments that has been circulating is that people ought to try and work out religious protections now, because the way things are going, it will be much harder to do in a few more years. I think there is a social learning process going on. Well, I guess what I'm inclined to do is to sort of go the other way. I helped organize a conference a couple of years ago, and it had some very strong traditional religion people there and some very strong LGBT world leaders. And on the one hand, it's quite clear that there's sort of militants on both extremes that will not find any possibility of compromise. I mean, but what was interesting to me was that some of the really prominent LGBT leaders who had been at this for a long time were saying, you know, we don't have to be afraid anymore. One of the reasons historically, one of the tragedies of religious freedom is people always claim religious freedom until they get power. This has been true in every century for the last 2,000 years. And one of the reasons that we have this kind of sick syndrome is that when people first come to power, they're very insecure and they're afraid. And therefore they push very hard to root out whatever they're seeing as the source of the persecution they've suffered in the past, and to entrench their positions. If religious freedom works right, it eliminates the fear and the basis for fear, because people will know they will be protected. This is why many of us love our country, because we know, even though in different parts of our histories we haven't been protected, that basically we will be protected. And I think the challenge going forward, you know, I think all sides have been guilty of sort of not compromising, and it's hard because, you know, you don't want to compromise what you think is the truth. But we have different visions of the truth, and the people are going to have to live together, and how do we do that? I think it's in everyone's interest to try and find ways. I think it's going to be very hard, because there are a lot of sort of extreme positions who will say no compromise. We don't need to compromise anymore, or we shouldn't give up an inch of ground, because any inch we give up is just lost, and you know, that's what will happen. I think at a certain point, if people start responding with something like the motto in Utah was "Fairness for All," trying to genuinely work at that, we have some hope of finding some solutions. And the world has changed. The same-sex marriage decisions signified a massive change. I mean, it's just amazing, because a decade ago, something like 30 of the states had passed constitutional amendments going the other direction. I mean, it's just, and many of you may have worked on some of these. And I think we can't yet see all the ways this is going to play out, all the issues that will arise. But we could have a continuing and intensified polarization, or we could have some kind of system where we learn to really apply what religious freedom is about, which is religious freedom for really strict believers, and religious freedom for others, and freedom for people who are seeing the world differently. And I think it's we've got some challenging times ahead. This is not going to be easy.
Okay, thank you so much for those questions, and thank you